What made you break the bro code you swore was sacred? It started the night Liam's 8-year-old, Sophie, turned up at my place just before midnight, backpack slung over one shoulder, a threadbare stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. I cracked the door and she breathed, barely louder than the hallway hum, "Uncle Derek, Dad's friends are coming tomorrow. I need somewhere to hide." Her hands shook so violently she dropped the rabbit twice. I handed it back and asked what hiding meant. She lifted her sleeve. A neat ladder of circular burns climbed her forearm, some raw and angry, others faded into scar tissue. "The game room," she murmured. "Only the special girls get picked. If I'm broken, they won't choose me." She'd been burning herself to be unwanted. I called Liam with fingers that wouldn't steady. "What is Sophie talking about?" I demanded. He gave me that easy, familiar laugh I'd heard 1,000 times over 15 years. "Come on, man. Kids exaggerate. She probably watched something creepy. Bring her home, we'll figure it out." But there was a thin, metallic ring to his voice, like he'd rehearsed the lines. It said something cold inside me. I hung up and looked at Sophie staring at the floorboards. "How many other girls?" She raised both hands and counted. 7. I'm the oldest. The little ones don't understand yet. My phone lit up with Liam's messages, accusing me of overreacting, ordering me to bring her back, threatening to call the cops for kidnapping. That was enough. I phoned my sister, Vanessa, a social worker. 20 minutes later she arrived in pajamas, took one look at Sophie's arm, and went ashen. She photographed everything. The burns were spaced with precision, no accident. When Sophie described the basement game room, the Friday drop-offs, the men arriving later, Vanessa's mouth thinned to a line. Sophie said Liam picked a girl based on who looked prettiest that week, and she'd been injuring herself for 3 weeks to make herself ugly. Vanessa called her supervisor. While we waited, Sophie nodded off on my couch, rabbit clutched to her chest. Liam's texts grew nastier, claims that Sophie was an attention seeker, that I was wrecking a friendship, that his lawyer would have me in cuffs by morning. None of that could scrub away what I'd seen on that child's arm, or the terror when she whispered about tomorrow. The supervisor showed up around 1 a.m. and recorded Sophie's statement. Sophie named 7 other girls, weekend custody kids like her, and explained how each tried to make herself less appealing. Mia yanked out chunks of hair. Zoe wore dirty clothes and refused to bathe. 8-year-olds inventing ways to be undesirable because they didn't have language for the danger. Police arrived an hour later. They took Sophie to the hospital and took my statement. At first the officers treated it like a custody fight. Then they saw the burns, heard Sophie calmly give the same details, the same timeline. One called for a detective. The other began mapping the pattern. Detective Rita Alvarez stepped into the hospital at 3 a.m., mid-40s, gray hair pulled tight, eyes that had seen too much. She interviewed Sophie while a forensic nurse documented every mark. Sophie described the locked basement door, the tripod and camera a friend of Dad's operated, the men raiding the girls and choosing one for private time. Rita's face didn't change, but her hand tightened on her pen when Sophie said she'd been chosen twice before she started burning herself. Could she identify the other girls and their fathers? Yes, Sophie said, and listed names and addresses memorized from playdates. While I sat stunned in the waiting room, Rita began making calls. I kept thinking about Liam, my roommate for 3 years, best man at my wedding, the guy I'd trusted with everything, now apparently coordinating something organized and monstrous. By dawn, Rita told me search warrants were being executed at 8 homes. Sophie would go to emergency foster care for now. I asked to see her. She was small on the hospital bed, rabbit under her chin. Am I in trouble for telling? She asked. I told her the only people in trouble were the adults who hurt her. As the sun climbed, Rita drove me home and explained that coordinated raids would happen at 8 a.m. She'd worked child exploitation cases for 12 years. The basement room. The ranking. The set schedule. It all matched known rings. Phone records already showed a group chat linking 8 fathers, including Liam. Back in my apartment, I replayed all the little moments I'd dismissed: fight nights I was never invited to when Sophie visited, the weekend secrecy, the time I'd dropped by unannounced and he'd been uncharacteristically angry. Signs I had smoothed over because he was my friend. At 8:30 Vanessa called. The raids had found camera equipment in every basement. The men were under arrest. The mothers were being questioned. Sophie's mom, Natalie, was at the station in tears. She'd seen the burns but believed Liam when he blamed divorce stress and self-harm. By noon Rita asked me to come in for a formal statement. I spent 3 hours sifting through 15 years of friendship looking for red flags, those poker nights I never met a single player from, the brand new basement locks for security, the defensiveness when I asked too many questions. In other rooms, two fathers had already begun minimizing. I only watched. Liam pressured me, and Rita's face made it clear she wasn't buying it. That evening, the headlines hit: 8 fathers arrested in coordinated raids on a child exploitation ring. My phone blew up. Some friends were supportive, others parroted false accusations rhetoric and scolded me for calling police instead of talking to Liam man-to-man. I blocked them. Vanessa warned that families were hiring heavy-hitting attorneys to spin it as mothers coaching kids. Patricia Winters, infamous in family law, held a press event. The children were manipulated, and the real abuse was slander destroying good men. But the basements contained cameras, and more. Over the next week, forensics teams pulled hundreds of videos from encrypted drives. The footage showed exactly what Sophie described: girls being scored, one chosen for the game room. Some files dated back 2 years. The youngest victim was 5. Evidence suggested Liam had seeded the whole system 3 years earlier after meeting like-minded fathers online. He recruited slowly, built trust, then revealed the real purpose of Friday nights. Rules. Secrecy. Jokes in the group chat about who'd be next and how to keep mothers in the dark. On Monday Natalie came by my place looking 10 years older. She cried and asked how she'd missed it. Sophie had been visiting every other weekend for 2 years. Anxiety had crept in before visits. Natalie read it as separation stress. When the burns appeared 3 weeks ago, Sophie claimed she found a lighter. Natalie believed her. Why wouldn't she? A preliminary hearing landed 3 weeks out. Rita said I'd have to testify about that night and what I saw. Defense lawyers moved to suppress evidence and discredit Sophie. Winters argued the warrants were based on a hysterical child's fantasy, citing school notes about Sophie's dramatic storytelling and creative writing. The DA, Marcus Shaw, countered with photos, consistent statements, and a medical report noting burn patterns requiring someone to hold the arm steady, undercutting the "I did it myself" story Liam had coached. I spent those weeks trying to reconcile the friend I loved with the reality of what he'd done, to strangers' children and to his own. Some mutuals cut me off, preaching bro code. One told me real friends don't involve authorities. I told him there's no clause in any code that protects child abusers and blocked his number. It still hurt. The hearing was brutal. 8 defense attorneys went after Sophie's credibility. Winters hammered behavioral problems, divorce anger, even last year's silly "dog ate my homework" lie. Then the DA played a video from Liam's basement. You could hear Sophie crying off camera while Liam's voice calmly instructed someone to start recording. The judge called a recess. When court resumed, 2 fathers had fired Winters and were lining up plea deals. Liam refused any deal. His new lawyer, Gregory Stone, claimed the videos showed poor judgment, not crimes, that the men were documenting self-harm and the rating system was a mental health assessment tool. The judge looked nauseated but let him say the words for the record. Trial set for 4 months out. Meanwhile the girls were placed with trauma-informed foster families. Sophie went to Dorothy, who had 3 decades of experience. Vanessa arranged monthly supervised visits. Sophie had stopped burning herself but started pulling her eyelashes when anxious. Dorothy said it was a control response. Sophie's therapy drawing swung dark, basements, cameras, angry stick figures, but also hope, rainbows, houses, a girl clutching a rabbit. Dorothy called the mix healthy, proof Sophie could still imagine light. Two mothers came forward with details they'd been too scared to share. Liam had been blackmailing them, photos from exchanges, threats to paint them unfit. Rebecca noticed bruises on Mia. Liam flashed a photo of her car outside a bar and threatened to tell a judge she had a drinking problem. She backed off, terrified of losing custody. Grace had reported to CPS months earlier. Liam buried the case under behavior issues paperwork. He'd studied the system and learned to game it. Rita built a conspiracy case showing Liam at the center, founder of the forum, architect of the rating rules, supplier of equipment, teacher of encryption. The chat logs read like orders from a ringleader. The night before I testified, the DA warned Stone would portray me as a jealous divorce or a glory seeker, maybe angling to replace Liam in Sophie's life. I needed to stay steady and stick to facts. The courtroom was packed when I took the stand. Natalie sat with the mothers. Sophie had testified earlier via closed circuit. I recounted the midnight knock, the burns, the call to Liam and how his voice sounded wrong, too smooth, too dismissive. On cross, Stone prodded at my divorce, hinted I envied Liam's stable family, waved old texts where I said I was lonely, suggested I craved the male role model spot in Sophie's life. He asked what proof I had beyond a traumatized child's story. The burns aren't a story, I said. They're on her skin. 3 weeks of testimony followed, forensics explaining the organization and the encryption, therapists describing consistent trauma responses, mothers recounting manipulation and threats, 2 fathers who'd flipped describing how Liam recruited and ran the show. And the videos, most damning of all. The jury deliberated 6 hours and convicted all 6 remaining defendants. Liam was found guilty of conspiracy, child abuse, exploitation, and unlawful imprisonment. Sentencing was set 6 weeks later. In cuffs, he stared at me like I was the villain. At sentencing, mothers gave impact statements. Rebecca described me as nightmares and fear of being alone with any adult man. Grace talked about Zoe's weight loss and hospitalization. The judge spent 15 minutes outlining the methodical cruelty. Liam created the ring, recruited the men, enforced the rules, showed no remorse, tried to blame victims. She sentenced him to 35 years, parole not possible for 20. Others got 12 to 25. Leaving court, I felt relief and grief braided together, relief that the girls were safe, grief for a friendship that never truly existed. Vanessa hugged me on the courthouse steps and said she was proud I'd chosen a child's safety over old loyalties. Over the next year Sophie flourished with Dorothy, twice-weekly therapy, new coping skills, the self-harm fading. Her lashes grew back. She stopped checking mirrors to see if she looked too pretty. I visited monthly. We baked cookies or played board games or talked about nothing. Eventually Derek became Uncle Derek again. Natalie worked through her guilt in family therapy. The transition home took time, day visits, then overnights, then weekends, until Sophie was ready for full-time placement. Dorothy remained in their lives. Other families healed unevenly. Some rebuilt trust, others struggled under resentment. 2 moms launched a support circle. Rebecca founded a nonprofit teaching parents how to spot and report abuse. Grace joined, sharing how her CPS report had been dismissed. They pushed for stronger protocols. I began speaking too, about how friendship can blind you. How predators look like coaches, neighbors, brothers, best friends, because that's how they get access. The hardest topic was the bro code, that toxic script telling men to cover for each other and handle it internally. Real loyalty, I said, is holding friends accountable and protecting people who can't protect themselves. At a school talk a teen asked whether I regretted losing my best friend. I told him I regretted that my friend had been a lie, but I didn't regret calling the police, testifying, or choosing Sophie's safety over my comfort. 3 years after the conviction, Sophie was 11, thriving, soccer, art classes, real friendships. Monthly therapy for maintenance. She wrote me a letter, "Thank you for believing a scared 8-year-old at midnight and choosing my safety over friendship." I still choke up reading it, remembering how close I came to believing Liam. As visitation rules relaxed, I had dinners at Natalie's. Normal conversations about school and friends and art projects replaced crisis talk. The guilt didn't vanish, but it loosened. 5 years after that knock, Sophie asked why I helped when her dad was my best friend. We were in Natalie's backyard, and she said kids protect friends who do bad things. Why hadn't I protected him? I told her friendship means helping people be better, not helping them harm others. No bond outranks a child's safety. Was I sad about losing my friend? I was sad about losing the person I thought Liam was. Maybe I didn't lose a friend so much as learn I'd never truly known him. The nonprofit grew. Rebecca expanded into school prevention programs. Grace built training for CPS workers on how abusers manipulate systems. I talked with men's groups and teams about masculinity, loyalty, and courage. Some men reached out afterward. One reported his brother-in-law, another called out friends for jokes that normalize violence. Small courageous acts add up. At Sophie's 14th birthday, I brought a professional art set. Her face lit up. She hugged me later and said she was glad I'd been brave when it was hard. That hug made all the lost friendships and courtroom storms feel worth it. When people asked about Liam, I didn't dramatize or minimize. He's serving 35 years for organizing and leading a child abuse ring. The friendship I thought we had was a facade. I missed who I believed he was, but that person wasn't real. I'd break any code again in a heartbeat to protect a child. By 16, Sophie had turned pain into purpose, speaking at assemblies about trusting your instincts and telling safe adults. She mentored younger survivors, kept her grades up, and earned a spot in a competitive summer art program. Trauma remained part of her story, not the whole story. I watched her address a high school with clarity and strength, describe the game room and the burns without breaking, and explain how speaking up saved her, and 6 others. Afterward, a student confided in her. Sophie handed over the advocacy center's number. She prepared for college, planning to study psychology and trauma recovery. The night before she left, we had dinner at my place. She told me she'd decided to forgive her father, not to excuse him or reconnect, but because carrying that anger was heavy. Forgiveness, she said, was a way to cut the rope tying her to what he'd done. I told her that was bravery of a different kind. I kept meeting men torn between loyalty and doing right. I told them about the midnight knock, how close I came to sending Sophie back because the truth was inconvenient, and how the bro code often exists to shield abusers. Real strength means choosing the vulnerable, even at the cost of friendships. More men began acting, reporting, confronting, protecting. Culture shifts by inches. Years later, one invitation floored me. Would I walk Sophie down the aisle? I said yes before she finished asking. The ceremony was beautiful. Natalie cried the whole time. Dorothy beamed from the front row. Survivors from that first group were there, living lives beyond their injuries. In her vows, Sophie said love means choosing someone's well-being over your own ease. She glanced at me, and I knew she meant that night. 2. At the reception, I spoke about Sophie's resilience and the privilege of witnessing her turn trauma into purpose. I raised a glass to choosing courage, breaking toxic codes, and believing children. Later, watching her dance, Natalie stood beside me and whispered, "Thank you for believing her. Thank you for calling the police, not trying to handle it quietly. Thank you for everything." I told her Sophie's healing took a village, but she shook her head. It started, she said, with opening the door at midnight and choosing a child over a friend. Everything else followed from that. Thanks for staying with the story this far. If it resonated, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.